In our study of the life divine, we have been reading the chapter titled Rebirth and Other Worlds, in which Sri Aurobindo has formulated the yogic perspective of person and personality. We are the true person as the conscious, evolving soul that puts forward a personality appropriate for a line of experience that it finds helpful in its journey, in order to be able to grow through the life experience, to draw out a certain facet or power or powers of its development, of its innate potential, infinite potential as in a seed, using the surface experience of personality in the world, forming this personality using three sheaths of the mind, the life, and matter, the physical body. In this, we have seen how the essence of the personality's growth and experience is absorbed by the true person, while the surface personality is dissolved successively through its three layers, and the essence of the experience absorbed forms a deeper psychic personality, which is also now our true personality. And this true person and true personality now, through successive incarnations, in which it retains the full impact of past growth and experience, and draws out from it the aspects or elements useful for the new life, continues to grow. So the true person and personality growing is within. The surface layers of surface personality and the false person on the surface are used as a point of contact with the world and then dropped as necessary. And the need to drop, we have seen, is present because the surface formulation is too narrow, insufficient for the possibilities of the inner which it wants to deploy. As a result, the memory of the past lives is to be discarded on the surface, and if it remains, it will only hinder the possibilities of the surface personality's free development and the possibility of the true evolution. And this, so far, has been our understanding that each of these surface persons is one step in a series of steps of the evolutionary change through which we rise to higher degrees of consciousness. And the fulfillment of the step of the surface formation is when it is discarded, so that it may keep a free space for a new personality and formation. It is the inner person that survives death, even as it pre-exists before birth. For this constant survival is a rendering of the eternity of our timeless spirit into the terms of time. And we saw the next paragraph where he describes why we feel or how we feel the need for persistence of the surface personality and even of the body, and under what conditions this can be made possible. But the need for this persistence comes from this truth, that the constant survival of the inner person is a rendering of the eternity of our timeless spirit into the terms of time. Our spirit is eternal in its base, timeless and even transcending time and space, puts forward a part of itself, a projection, which is the true person entering space and time, and therefore able to experience growth. But this projection of the true person from the spirit entering space-time must render the truth of our eternity into time, and therefore it carries that eternity or the sense of eternity, even as it grows. It is immortal. But if this is true of the true person within, why should this not reflect into the surface personality? In fact, because the truth of this reflects in the surface personality, we feel the need for the permanence of our personality. Even though we have seen the logic of why it should not be permanent. Because if we persist in a narrow personality, it will prevent free growth of the true person. And yet, this is there as a reflection of the deep truth. And somehow it evokes in our mind the dream that perhaps we can make this as permanent as our true soul. This takes a certain form. In the Mahabharata, there is an incident where the wise of the 5 brothers, Yudhishthira, is challenged by a yaksha, a subtle being who presides over certain spaces in nature. And the yaksha challenges him and says, if you can answer my questions, then I will free your brothers who were rendered unconscious for violating his conditions of not drinking the water which belonged to him. Something. And so Yudhishthira says, all right, go ahead. And the first question is, what is the most surprising thing in the universe? And Yudhishthira's answer, which is the correct answer that the yaksha expects, is, although everyone knows that they have to die, everyone behaves as if they will never die. And if you think about it, somewhere deep within our surface personality, the eye of the mind, when it looks at itself, knows I was born, knows that there is an average human lifespan. If I am lucky, I can push a little beyond it. Someday it has to end, I have to shed the body. And yet in my day-to-day practical activity, I refuse to face that truth. I refuse to plan for it or act as if I am going to die someday. Because even to think that I am going to die feels wrong. Because my sense of I, even on the surface, is a kind of a reflection of the true I, which knows its immortality. And here on the surface, I feel I should be immortal, although I don't recognize that immortality in the facts of my life. But I should be immortal. And that's why we behave as if we will be immortal. And when we finally have to face the fact that we are not going to be immortal, we try to prolong the life by whatever means possible. Or if nothing else, imprint our stamp distinctly in the world in a way that the stamp will become immortal. So a wealthy person will create a foundation in his own name or in his parents' name who passed away, as a way of instituting the name and immortalizing it, or create something worthwhile that will persist long after I have shed or died. And this need for immortality in the surface is what Sri Aurobindo has pointed to. The dogma of the resurrection of the body attests to this demand. And what is the demand? Our normal demand of survival asks for a similar survival as the soul, for the mind, life, and even our body. And through the age-long effort of man, there has been this effort to discover the elixir of immortality by any means, magical, alchemic, or scientific, to conquer physically the death of the body. And we saw last time these 3: magical, alchemic, or scientific are really different facets of the same. The difference is only the particular scope of emphasis they have. While the modern scientific is largely focused on physical means, the magical is focused on subtle or occult means, and the in-between alchemic straddles both. We saw some examples of that. But it's worth exploring the form that it takes and the way it makes our mind pursue. And in a quick survey, I want to touch upon certain forms because they will help us recognize the character of this impulse And then we will move to the conditions in which Aurobindo says such a persistence of personality is actually possible. And what we have to do to make this possible. In the Indian tradition, there are many alchemical texts, and they survive in ways that to the modern mind are surprising. Even as recently, I believe in the 1950s, there was a demonstration which is recorded in the newspapers of that period, where somebody demonstrated publicly how he took a large quantity of mercury, the metal, and mixed into it certain products of his, which is what they call the philosopher's stone, or the bija in Sanskrit, which is the seed, and heated it, and publicly before an audience of respected people, including judges of the courts, he converted it into gold, which was then validated by everybody. And the newspaper report records this. So the knowledge has survived. If today such a person declares that he can do it, he will surely be kidnapped and either killed or jailed to reveal his secret. And so the knowledge necessarily must lie behind the scenes. But the alchemical idea was not only that this bij, the seed, can transmute metals, but it can also in the physical body give you an effective immortality. We have a story which goes back to about 500 years ago. One of the greatest tantrics of relatively recent times. In India, if you say 1,000 years, that's not very old. So 500 years ago is a recent thing. And he was in Orissa. His name was Achyutananda, a very famous name. And he was a master of the tantric and alchemical knowledge. He had, as demonstration of his great power, a being, a yaksha, subtle being, who was like a servant to him, whom he could demand at will to do things. The king once invited him, got him drunk, and then asked him, well, what's the phase of the moon? And he said, in his drunken state, he said, oh, it is new moon. And the king laughed and pointed out that it was not new moon, it was full moon. And so in the arrogance of his power, Achyutananda said, well, I will prove to you that it's the new moon. And he took a bowl of water into which the moon was reflected, and then did his magical incantation to cover the moon which was in the water, and it vanished from the sky, at least to the vision of people. Such was his power that he could conceal it, or as they would see it, he hid it into his bowl of water. But the end of his life is interesting. He wanted to help humanity. So he pursued this knowledge of alchemy and discovered finally the secret by which all illnesses could be healed and the human body could become immortal. And when he was ready to share this with humanity, his son came up and said, I'm sorry, I cannot allow you to do this, because you will change the balance of human life and God's balance, and you are not the one who can counter God. Therefore, from my sense of right, I am required to cut off your head. So his father said, all right, since you are my son, I cannot refuse you. It's your duty, you perform your duty and I will perform mine. And so he calls his yaksha, his yakshini, it's a female deity, it's a female form. He says, Yakshini, come now and you assist me. And so he places his head, his son cuts off his head, and the yakshini promptly lifts the head and puts it back and joins it. And the father says, now that you have performed your duty, your work is done, and I am free to follow my duty. And he says, Yakshini, let's go away. And poof, he vanishes. That's the story, popularly known, and never again to be seen. Some say he is still alive, some say he is in a subtle form, whatever. But such kinds of stories, sufficiently concrete in history to leave an impact that people do not forget, point to the fact that this quest has been and still continues to be so compelling to humanity. There are still the texts which describe step by step through 16 stages how to create that bija which will not only transmute base metals into gold but give you immortality. And there are still people attempting because the instructions are so clear. except there are certain terms in Sanskrit we're not too sure what exactly they mean. So there's always some cloudiness to the practice. In its current form in science, it has taken a very different turn. The idea is to be able to go deep into the biology and in the genetical science. We're able to watch how the genetics of the body degrade with age, and therefore its functions also. And so there are attempts to trigger off body functions to neutralize the body functions degradations. For a while, about 100 years, they had this idea that certain glands from a young monkey had the necessary extract needed. If you infused it into the human blood, it would give you the youth and vitality of the monkey. And it was very popular for life extension or life improvement, at the very least to reduce the symptoms of aging. To this day, there are different kinds of potions validated scientifically in the lab. There is a particular material which is used in rats. It was shown that when rats were administered a large dose of resveratrol, the rats not only regained their youth, but the old rats were behaving like the young rats in many ways. In some of them, even the hair became black once again. And so this has become a popular thing for human beings to try to take. But it doesn't have as dramatic a result in humans, either because if you want to believe the conspiracy, they don't give you the same thing, or they give you a diluted form, or perhaps the human beings are slightly different from rats. We do not know. But at a genetic level, there are materials which reverse the aging process, which is measured in the genes by the reduction of the telomeres, the ends of the chain of the genes which become shorter until the gene's protection breaks down, and so they degrade and you have aging, or at least that's the logic of it. If you can reverse the telomere growth, and so there are again certain products which seem to be able to do that, not only in rats but in humans. They seem at best to extend the quality of life into age. In rats, certain products have been shown to increase, or especially in worms, to increase lifespan by up to 30%. And why not in human beings? We do see, though, a trend with better quality of life, both psychologically and physically, that there is an extension in lifespan. And yet it does not quite come close to what we hear from old stories. If you go back to the Mahabharata or in the biblical tradition, you know of the older people of these traditions who used to live for 1,000 years. And somehow we, having a typical age of 70 to 80, somehow does not match anywhere near that. We can understand going from 70 to 80, from 80 to 90, or even from 100 to 110, but 1,000 is still a big difference. What can be done for that? Recently there's been a huge investment by some of the most powerful non-pharmaceutical industries, including Google, in anti-aging technologies. We hear stories from people inside the system who claim that they have actually broken through the secret and can now extend lifespan even by many decades, even by a few hundred years. Whether it's true or not, it does not change the fact that after a few hundred years, you would still experience the decline and aging. One of the persons who was part of these programs even declared that in a few years they will reveal the means by which they can push the human lifespan to 1,000 years. Now consider what would happen to you if you lived for 1,000 years. If it is the same personality, and your personality increasingly becomes more restrictive, less flexible, what would happen? Already we see from the point we have hit 60, when we compare ourselves with children who are in their teenage, some of the things that they're able to do, we cannot do. And to the extent that our personality refuses to do. I gave the example last time of using mobile phones with touch screens or tablets or computers. Somewhere within we feel ourselves unable to or refusing to. Even if we do, we find it so difficult to adapt. So it is a narrowing of the flexibility of something, not just the body, but the mind. And you feel out of place in the world. And if you were to push this now another 100 years, imagine how much more out of place it would be. And if you push it for 1,000, you would feel a bit of a relic, being quite unable to synchronize with reality. So these possibilities are actually explored in other ways in science fiction. And we can play with those ideas also briefly to see how it works out. It's a very interesting recent series on television which is called Altered Carbon, based on a series of novels, where the idea is that they implant something at the base of the neck that's continuously registering all your memories and records it in a little metallic substance. And so if the physical body is destroyed, you can take that out and plug it into another body. And your entire consciousness, full memory is transferred into the other. And then explore what human society would be like with this. And one of the interesting things which happens there is, very quickly, people get bored. Very quickly, they realize now that they are effectively immortal. They can change their bodies, swap them out. Changing bodies and playing with new body forms becomes a kind of a pastime for the rich, but the poor can't afford it. And they speak of bodies as sleeves, changing your sleeves, and the personality being the same. When the sleeves change, they explore this idea that having a younger body would involve certain changes because of the hormones which are different. And with an older body, it has different results, although you, as a memory, are still the same. But after a point, you get bored. What do? And they show the decline of society. It reaches a point where some of them even recognize that with the effective immortality, people get worse because they forget the fear of death. And those who are very rich become more tyrannical, those who are poor become more hopeless and helpless. And the scene of the novel series is really one of decline. I'm giving this as an example because humanity wants to explore what it could be like, and often it is in science fiction that these explorations go forward. There were other similar explorations which also are fascinating for the conclusions that they come to. But all of these point to the fact that Sri Aurobindo has placed before us. We would not feel satisfied if the personality did not change sufficiently. We would stop growth individually and then eventually in society, collectively, if there is not enough change of the personality. And it's the reason why, as we saw last time, nature does not consider this to be important and does not make much arrangement for the continuation of the personality. Now we come to the key here. But this aspiration could only succeed if the mind, life, or body could put on something of the immortality and divinity of the indwelling spirit. And this is the logic of immortality of the surface personality. Remember what is immortal. As the soul, the true person, reflects the immortality of spirit in its individuality, in the psychic being. And if anything of the surface, mind, life and body, must share in that immortality, then they too should reflect or take on some character of the spirit or of the psychic being. The only thing which is unborn, having no beginning, therefore can be without end. We discussed last time the logic of why things have to end. When we are born, that is emerging from an agglomeration of substance. That's what born means. Something gathered to form you. Then the thing around you continues to change while you don't change, and eventually you cannot draw sustenance from that environment anymore unless you keep up with the change. And if you keep up with the change, eventually the change is so great, you are no more who you were before. And so you have effectively changed so much, you are not the same, and you have died and something else has taken its place. That's what it comes to. If you think about it in this way, anything which is born emerging from limitation and living in limitation will eventually collapse in its limitations as the universe moves forward in order to keep up with the universe or lose the synchronization with the universe and become irrelevant. And so the key is this: to put on something of the immortality and divinity of the indwelling spirit. And as that factor grows in you, that aspect or that part, not being essentially born or made from an agglomeration of things, acquires the capacity to stay on. So this aspiration could only succeed. This is the only condition required, that it has to take on this. If the mind, life or body could put on something of the immortality and divinity of the indwelling spirit. Immortality and divinity. The two are related. Immortality is the state of consciousness, of the sense of never being born and always being. And this state belongs to that which is unborn, which is divine. And the divinity is that which manifests all those qualities which belong to the divine. Its nature of wisdom, consciousness, its substantial character of the Satchidananda, and so on. So, something of those things must put on the mind, life and body. And then Sri Aurobindo says, there are certain circumstances in which the survival of the outer mental personality, representative of the inner mental Purusha, could be possible. Now it's left in a kind of a vague thing. The circumstances do exist, but within those circumstances, it could be possible. He doesn't say, if you fulfill these circumstances, it will happen. Because the circumstances themselves are not enough. They are a precondition. Once the circumstances are fulfilled, there is still the factor of reflecting in those circumstances the character of the something of the immortality and divinity of the indwelling spirit. So you will see the circumstances describe something which is part of the surface personality, but that's not enough. That's a precondition. Upon that, the inner must reflect. If these two conditions are fulfilled and the soul accepts to carry, remember the soul has the choice, it accepts to carry, then yes, this would be possible. The phrase he uses, survival of the outer mental personality. Not the inner personality, outer mental personality. That's this part of your mind that says, I am conscious. I am this person which is thinking. And that's the most surface part. What is the inner part of the mind? And he says it is representative of the inner mental Purusha. The inner part of the mind is that part of which your mind is not conscious. And yet there is a constant interchange between the inner and the outer. Let's take a simple example. When you have to remember something, do you remember what time you woke up in the morning? Your mind instantly turns to look back, so to say, at your past memories. And the memory of that time either is vague, your mind remains focused, and then it pops up. When it pops up, you recognize, this is it. But you did not actually delve into all the memories of your brain or mind to drag it out. Or even more obvious example is to pick something from your entire life, which was the most happy moment of your life. And now you have a whole lifetime, whatever number of decades that you have memory of. Your mind does not need to go through all the memories of every day of all those decades. It turns with an intention, and then out of somewhere, one or two memories come up, and then your mind chooses between these two and says, this one is more than that. But how did those memories pop up? Who did that? Who knew them all? And who, in the response to your turning within to seek an answer, pushed forward the memory that you were seeking? And that's the inner mind. The entire domain of the inner realm of consciousness is opening out to infinity, eventually into the universal mind. Between that and your surface mind is a gap. It is this gap which makes you think that you are only this surface mind. When you go into deep sleep and the surface mind shuts down, goes to sleep, your consciousness does not lose consciousness. It continues in those inner layers. And sometimes it wanders in those inner grades of consciousness. Memories of it remaining you recall as dream. Or even in that inner consciousness which opens out to the universe, you wander out into things which are outside your narrow personality, experience those things, and when you come back, you may even remember doing things, meeting people, or whatever it is, as a distinct memory. Of who? Not the surface waking mind, of the inner mind. And so because there's a gap between the two, you say, as I woke up, the dream began to fade away. Because you were making a transition from the inner mind to the outer mind. And if you take pains to try to remember a little bit, when you are in the in-between stage, your outer mind registers what the inner mind is still holding, and then you come out completely and only that registration remains. You've forgotten everything else. On the other hand, as you slide back into sleep, if you try to remember or you catch the tail of the dream, as you slide back into sleep, the full memory of the dream might come back. And then you will lose the memory that you remembered because you've slipped into the inner mind and the outer mind is shut down. There is an equivalent experience in the vital. Your life energies and your narrow personal energy which forms your vitality is the surface vital. There is similarly the inner vital which opens out eventually and joins the universal vital. Similarly, a physical body also has an inner physical grade which is much more plastic, although as dense as this physical body. So the real personality of which you are not conscious is in the inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. And this outer mind personality represents something of the inner mind, but in a very limited way. And yet you have in the outer mind the sense of I am conscious, a center of your mind. That outer mind personality and its sense of center is a reflection of the center of the inner mind. And the center of the inner mind is what he calls here the inner mental Purusha. When in deep meditation, your consciousness goes within and becomes aware that you're aware and holds in a mental position this poise of awareness, conscious of the field of your mind, conscious of the thoughts which come in and go, you may be partly interiorized in the inner mind, but the sense of I there, witnessing, not actually thinking, simply aware of the thoughts wandering, is the inner mental Purusha. In a sense, it's a reflection of the poise of the self in the consciousness of the mind. There's a similar reflection of the poise of the self in the vital body and consciousness, which would be the inner vital Purusha, and a similar reflection in the inner physical Purusha. Because there is an inner mental Purusha, on the surface of the mind you have also the sense of I am conscious as a center, a Purusha, as the center of your personality. But it's not a Purusha, it's actually the center of a whirlpool. There's the whirling of the thought and a kind of a referential center which is not fixed, unlike the true Purusha. It wanders. When I'm depressed, my sense of center sinks and I'm thinking, oh, what a miserable life I have. I am so whatever. And then when the same consciousness shifts, because the whirlpool center has drifted now to a higher state, and I'm conscious in the higher place, I say, oh, I am so lucky. Why was I thinking those thoughts? But the I, which is the center of the whirling consciousness and thoughts, is wandering. It is not fixed, unlike the true center of the mental Purusha. It's wandering. And therefore, nothing in it really has the character of permanence. Although in the mental consciousness there is a center which is of permanence. Because it exists, it compels on the surface in a reflection the sense of a center where I feel I am the center of my thoughts and I can control my thoughts. But the control is partial because, as I said, it's only a temporary center because of the nature of the world. So it is to this he is referring. And now we reread the sentence, you will see what it means. There are certain circumstances in which the survival of the outer mental personality representative of the inner mental Purusha could be possible. And so you see the outer mental personality represents this. It has the sense of individuality because it reflects the inner mental Purusha. But the true power of permanence is closer to the inner mental Purusha, not in the surface mental personality. So something is required now for these two to be linked. And now he says, what are those circumstances? It could happen if our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface and so much one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. So the mind should now be following these three conditions, such that the soul will say, there's no point dissolving this because I can actually continue in this. But still the choice is in the hands of the soul. The soul may say, yeah, it's almost there, but not good enough. I still want to dissolve it. It's choice. And its choice meaning your choice, you the real person who incarnates. And at the time of death, there is, or just before death of the body, you never die. You should never say, I die or I will die. You never die. The body dies, the body is shed, whatever. At the time of death of the body, your consciousness is strongly pulled inward, comes close enough to the soul that the surface mind or the inner mind now reflects the soul's perception towards life. You look back upon the whole journey of life. In a single gaze, in a single moment, the entire journey of life is gazed upon. And in that single vision, the choice is obvious. This. It's obvious and the thing is done. What this? It can take two forms. First, it may say, not yet, there's something to be finished. This often is the memory of people who had near-death experiences, either at the time of passing due to an illness or particularly during accident. The person is driving, for example, there's a collision that takes place. He's conscious of the collision and then momentarily his consciousness is thrown out from the surface. It shifts to the inner because the soul comes forward to take seize on that moment. And in human time, it may be a fraction, and to the sense of the soul, because it comes forward, it is an eternity of the moment. It gazes at the whole life and makes a choice. No, I have still something to finish. And poof, the consciousness falls back into the normal surface. The decision was made, and in the collapse of the car, somehow you survive. And if the soul had said, okay, it doesn't matter, it's finished, then in the collapse of the car, the soul would use the occasion to somehow leave. But if it chooses to stay, it has the power to somehow prevent, in spite of the damage done to the car, to the body, to not leave the body, to infuse its influence enough that you recover and survive and so on, with whatever the consequences which the soul has already foreseen in a sense. But now if that memory remains of that moment, you will see the personality, the surface personality is changed forever. Suddenly the personality becomes so much more calm, detached, in some way impersonal and yet intensely loving and caring. all characteristics of the soul, which momentarily imprinted itself on the surface consciousness, or the surface consciousness was pulled in enough to make that contact, and if the memory remains, this thing remains. You're changed fundamentally in your consciousness. But it should not need an accident to do this. We can do this consciously by a conscious interiorization and communion with the divine presence within, allowing its influence to fill us, shape us, and even to lead us. To that extent, we can be much more conscious of the inner. But when this decision is taken, it is by the soul. And so when the time comes to shed the body, even as a result of aging, the soul looks back and says, okay, I've done everything. But at that moment, it turns forward and it's obvious what it wants next. In the very thing which is most lacking in this experience, or the thing most required to complete it and give it the fullness for its evolution. And that choice is made at that moment as it turns to prepare for the leaving of the body. It's the reason why in all spiritual traditions, that moment where you leave the body is considered so important. There are certain traditions which have stories which tell you things. I don't know to what extent this story is actually physically valid. There's some truth to it, but the story goes like this from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that there was a great sage, who at the time of death, he looked at an attendant who was female and had some strong sexual thoughts in relation to her. And so when he died, his soul immediately went and took birth in a donkey. And he lived that incarnation before, so that he expended that desire before he could be reborn in a human and continue his spiritual journey. Now, it's presented like this. It's not how it works from the soul's viewpoint. The mother explains, you never go back to an animal level. But the truth of it is valid, that at the time when you separate from the body and shed the physical and vital sheaths, the elements of strong desire in the vital float out. If they're strong formations, they attach themselves to equivalent vibrational beings. And in this case, if it was a certain desire urge, it would attach itself to a nearby donkey, for example. It doesn't mean the soul has got into the donkey, but something of that imprint of the vital body may go into it. We have in India this tradition that when somebody passes away, you feed the crows to satisfy any desires which may be remaining. And the idea is some element of the vital body attaches itself to the crows, which are also desire beings, much more. And we have seen this even here when Panditji's sister passed away. For 3 days the crow came and demanded food, and we gave it, and then it was gone, and it never bothered again. And it was as if elements of the desire of the vital sheath, as they are dissolved, attach to things. Mother explains how even sometimes they may not be desire, but they are vital energy formations. They even attach to plants, because that's where they find themselves most easily in affinity. But the teaching in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition uses this story to highlight the fact that what you aspire for at the moment of death is what you will become or what you will choose for the next life. And that truth is valid. Of course, it's not the surface desire, it is the soul's choice which is the truth of the incarnation. But that moment is considered sacred for this reason, because literally the next step is decided here and all the rest is only a assimilation, rest and preparation for the next incarnation. So why is this important? Why are we dwelling on this? Remember, this is what the soul needs. It should be able to take this personality and it should be able to recognize I can shape it flexibly as I want for my next step without needing to dissolve. And if it can do that, it can say, well, I don't need to dissolve, I can carry this with me. And it will shed the gross physical body, it will shed the vital body, and it will carry the mental body, not entirely again. The parts of the mental body which are still too rigid, it will shed and absorb the essential part which is now sufficiently plastic and usable. and carry it and infuse it into the next incarnation, now shaping it as it wants, because it's able to shape it. In such a case, it will be very interesting, elements of the personality can carry over in a dramatic way. I'm reminded of an example, which is, it's worthwhile to see this on the computer, on the YouTube. You will search for Amira Willigagen. She's a young girl from Netherlands at the age of, I believe it was 8, that she appeared for a performance or a competition which was called it's a singing competition. And when she came on the stage, there are 3 judges there. They say, "What are you going to sing?" She says, "I will sing an opera." The judges laugh. 8-year-old girl, what will she sing? And one of the judges says, "Should I block my ears? Will it be terrible?" And the girl very confidently says, "No." And so they wait, and the girl starts singing. From the very first moment that she sings, her voice changes, her face changes, her body language changes. You see there a mature, developed, aged woman, and the voice is so perfect and flawless in the highest style of the opera tradition. The judges can't contain themselves. And one of the girls, women judges, she gets up in excitement, unable to contain, and she says, "Oh, it's an old soul, it's an old soul." And that's true. Then they asked the girl, "How did you learn? Who trained you?" She says, "I watched on YouTube and imitated." Now, what in a young girl from the age of 5 makes her want to watch opera song of all things and not cartoons and other trash? What makes her enjoy it? What makes her then want to imitate it? And what awakens in her imitation that flawless perfection of an adult who has trained an entire lifetime to perfect her voice? It's unexplainable. Try that with a child. Get a 5-year-old girl to say, "I'm going to train you to sing opera." They will get pretty much fed up with the training. And she does it on her own. No one pushed her to do it. And then, of course, now she's a famous performer. As 13-year-old girl, she's singing on the stage with big adults. But in that moment, if you see the video, you can see the face change. And when she brings on the high notes, it's the body language as an adult who takes on the high notes. The element of the personality which had perfected the opera singing imprint in the mind-vital complex. And it's not, and even to some extent, the physical. That aspect of the personality, the soul gathered, held into itself, infused into the new substance of mind-life-body as it is formed. And therefore, in the personality of this child, suddenly, with no memory of it, she finds this great attraction. And in the body, instinctively, she knows how to shape her throat and her voice and her mouth. The training which people go through in adulthood for years to shape the whole vocal cords and the structure of the mouth, she has that instinctively as a familiarity or an ease. Listening to someone singing, she catches the form that she has to hold this. And in the mind and in the vital, there's a familiarity with it that she can now push it to the level that to her is her past life's perfection of that skill. Nothing else of the personality has come through. Just this, which the soul found sufficiently developed and worthwhile and plastic enough to carry. Now, it does not mean it will carry it for the next life. It may even be that in this life, after the age of 18 or 20, suddenly there will be a shift in her personality and she will say, "Look, I'm quite fed up with this. I want to do something else." But in this case, the soul chose and infused and developed it. In the next life, even if she continues in this life with the same skill, she may choose to discard it. And at best, there will be a kind of an affinity to that kind, a skill as a child, but the mind may say, "Now I want to develop my power of the intellect." She may become a computer programmer or an engineer or anything. It doesn't matter. But this principle, we have to recognize how it works. the soul can absorb the essential familiarity into the consciousness. I deliberately gave the example of that series called Altered Carbon, because they have this idea that when the personality is now transferred into a new body, into a new sleeve, the person still has to work with integrating the consciousness with the body. And the body is found to be sluggish. It does not have the same reactions that the consciousness is used to. And it needs to as if be infused into the body to be able to develop it. And this principle actually takes place when the soul now gathers material for the new mind-body. It infuses something of its mind consciousness which it has gathered. It infuses something of the vital if it has kept it. And when the physical body is being formed while it is still in the womb, a very developed soul might preside over its formation by infusing something of its consciousness into it. Or a less developed one entering the soul at the time of birth would still push forward certain instincts of the body in the body as an instinct of the life energy, which shapes now the body not only in its behavior but even in its subsequent growth. From a newborn to an adult, the entire body's substance and tissue undergoes many changes, and many times over. So if you infuse a sustained will of the life force, as the body grows, as it develops, it shapes the physical form of the body to a degree that even it can infuse in the nerves a greater sensitivity, in the brain a greater complexity, in the physical muscle also a different plasticity or consciousness as the body grows, if the soul carries all this and chooses to infuse it. Now, all of this is very important for us to understand what this nature of the transition will be. If all of this has to be carried over, all of this which you want to carry over must fulfill the three criteria which he describes here. And that's why this detailed discussion of the carryover process. From this, it will be obvious why those three criteria are so important. Even this will go so far, if the inner instinct carries certain impressions of the physical form of the body, the soul can infuse elements of it into the new physical tissue. And although at birth the face of the child is more pliable and not so obvious, as it forms itself within a year or two, the face will begin to acquire the character of the infusion of the soul's will or consciousness. And then we will see suddenly, in this family, everybody resembles each other to some degree, but this child is unusual. Not only appears different, behaves different, has different values. For example, the child suddenly feels it hates meat in a family in which everybody eats meat for generations. The child is, I know people like that, they throw the meat under the table or hide it behind somewhere until eventually it's discovered. But why? What in you is creating the distaste? And it comes in the smell. Because somewhere inside the familiarity of that old personality and its sense of sensitivity to certain vibrations has been infused in the physical body and even the sense of smell. And the child says, no, that's not what I want. I don't like this vibration and smell. And a similar selection can begin to happen with the thoughts. Very quickly, certain values of thoughts which are part of the culture, the child begins to reject or react against, shrinking from them to protect itself or affirming something and facing consequences of discomfort. Something of this type, almost all of us might have had in our childhood. If you have a strong spiritual orientation and you grew up in a family which did not have it, or even if it had it, you had something strong, you will find there were elements like this which were unexplainable in your childhood, which were brought over from the previous life. And it does not involve any memory of the previous consciousness required, other than this tendency of the consciousness. No memory of the personality. But now you can see how if this much can be brought over and more of this can be grown, it can even take the form where, in the case of the young girl, as she sings the opera, she has brief flashes of what it feels like to be on stage. Pictures may not arrive, but in the body, the feeling of that confidence. And you will see that in the video, if you should see this. Her whole body form changes as she sings. And if that much can come, why not brief flashes even of images? Why not then brief flashes even of certain memories, which are worthwhile selectively for the soul? And you can see now, once you have got to this point, progressively more and more of the previous personality could have been carried to the extent the soul feels itself useful for the new form. Of course, it may deliberately shed elements of memory because that will interfere with the free development of personality. Or if the personality is sufficiently formed, it may even keep those to the extent necessary. So now that we have seen this whole in detail, what are the most obvious things which are required for this transmission? The first thing is there must be sufficient organization of that personality or that skill or that tendency of consciousness. In the case of the opera singer, enough organization of the consciousness of the affinity with the music, familiarity with it, the joy of the energy flow, and the particular imprint of consciousness in the physical body. All of this should have been sufficiently organized, individualized as a bundle that it can survive as a whole. And let's contrast this with someone else who has not organized it. I'm a good singer, I can sing well, I have all this capacity and skill, but it is not sufficiently integrated that it becomes an independent bundle of consciousness. And you see lots of such examples. Only somebody who is trained upon it for an entire lifetime and built that individuality, even formed the whole life around it, would have created that kind of a very distinct integration of that total bundle. So the first requirement is powerful individualization. Second requirement is, remember, all this developed here on the surface is still representing something of the inner consciousness which is reflecting the immortality of the spirit. It is the inner consciousness which is most close to the soul, which is the most absorbed. It is the outer part which is most fixed to the body and most discarded. So in this opera practice in the past incarnation, the woman would have had practiced this in a form that meant for her her whole being's dedication. That it became a form of the inner being's aspiration to develop this and to sing in a way that the values of the inner being became the prime driver of the outer development. So, it wouldn't be enough if you're a good performer. I perform on stage and we're in a traveling circus where I sing well, everybody claps, I go away, I've got my food for the day. That's not it. It would very likely have been a total dedication in a Godward aspiration, perhaps. Or in a dedication that involves a perfection which is so idealistic that it crosses the threshold of personal interest and acclaim or fame or other benefits which might still have been there, but they were not her primary drive. Only in that case, the inner values would have infused the outer, and the outer would then have been connected with the inner sufficiently that it could be absorbed into the inner consciousness and therefore carried by the soul. So the second requirement becomes the becoming one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha. And the third requirement, with all this developed, there has to be enough plasticity that in deploying this in a new personality or new body, you shall not be narrowed down and blocked into it. Now here it's not just the skill we are looking at. The skill itself now brought into a new body with completely new brain, new tissue, new circumstances, new personality. It can still plastically adjust to fill the new frame. But this discussion is much more now in relation to the entire personality, not just a skill which is absorbed. So, Already what has happened in the case of Amira Viligagan is that the society has pushed her into becoming another opera singer. She's now a big performer. You have 1,000 people coming to her performances, child prodigy and so on. She's been put into a groove. If the soul is happy with that, it may continue for a while. But as I said, once she comes into her own as an individualized personality, even she may turn against and revolt, or she may feel trapped if the personality is forced into it and so on. But in this case, we are looking at something broader. We took this as an example of the mechanism of transfer. And now we have to look at this in the aspect of the entire personality. First, we'll look at all three terms now. It could happen if our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface. The entire personality needs to be integrated around a center which is sufficiently stable and sufficiently formed that it can hold and carry its own. And so much one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha, that means breaking the barrier between the outer mind and the inner mind, and infusing into the outer the prime drivers of the values of the inner Purusha and the inner mind, and absorbing the outer activity until it merges into the inner consciousness so that the activity comes from the inner. I give the example of this singer. In her case, it would have been very likely there would have been a strong spiritual turn, and I don't mean religious necessarily. It wouldn't be that she's singing in the church. You could still sing in the church for God with that idea, and it's your job, it's your duty. It's not that. For her, it was a sacred experience in her consciousness. It had a sanctity or a spiritual content to the experience itself, and so that would lead to the integration of with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha. And then at the same time, Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, and at the same time, so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. Why and at the same time? The very suggestion is it contradicts the first movement. You see, the first movement was individualizing, organizing an individuality. And what happens with individuality? You tend to get fixed. You tend to become narrow. And then if you integrate with the inner, your fixity has now got a depth, which itself would now bind the depth to a fixity of the form, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, capital I. It almost seems contradictory in terms. And this is going to be the secret for us. To form an organized individuality, to bridge with the inner, and yet not become rigid, and yet remain plastic. How plastic? Not just plastic that I can adapt to, let's say, changing audiences, in her case of the singer, or changing cultures when I walk from one country to another. So open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. And what's the infinite doing? It is pushing upon you, working upon you to compel progress. And you should be responsive to that push of the progress. Not progress just of the soul, progress pushed by the infinite, capital I. Not just an infinity in terms of physical width, an infinity in consciousness. Now the word infinite, capital I, of consciousness is different in Sanskrit. Infinite in English has the etymology of in and finite, suggesting not finite. So the mind quickly says, all right, just take a finite and continue it unendingly. Not finite. But in Sanskrit, it is ananta. An, again not. Anta, end. The suggestion is different. Not finite, not ending. Meaning what? When the infinite or ananta reveals itself, it can go on revealing and revealing and revealing without end. You see, the sense of finite boundary is not there. The sense of infinite potential to manifest is there. And the capital I, infinite, we have to understand in this way, as Ananta. When the infinite consciousness of the divine pours itself out into the universe, it reveals extraordinary things. And across all the galaxies, across all the solar systems and all the planets, going into trillions and trillions, nothing is ever repeated. No grain of sand is exactly the same as another. No wave on the shore of a planet, whether of a water or of methane or any other liquid hitting rock, is ever the same. No bubble in the water and the foam of the wave's crest is ever the same as any other. And unendingly it pours out something new and new and new, never exhausting. What happens after a while? You will say it is monotone, it is similar to. No, and that's the beauty of it. As it unfolds, it reveals something more in grade of consciousness. And something more. When you think, oh, now I'm beginning to get it, I know what the plan is, poof, something new emerges. And this sense of the newness of the powers of consciousness unendingly revealed is our sense of evolution. I see why this progressive action of the infinite is so critical. When the consciousness now works on the personality and works through it, it must find the plasticity that it can unendingly draw out and more and more and more, not only in skill and domain, range of domains of skill, but in ascension of consciousness. It should be plastic enough that whatever new demand comes upon you, you should be able to grow with it and rise with it. So now we will reread the sentence and you see the import of these three and the relationship of these three. It could happen, that is, the mental consciousness could survive into the next. It could happen if our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface and so much one with the inner mind and inner mental Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. Remember always the reference, the soul needs to progress. And the mind is only your vehicle for that. And if anything in the mind is blocking that possibility, the soul would need to discard it. But if the mind is sufficiently individualized, unified with the inner, and yet plastic at the same time, then it can say, oh yeah, this is usable. And then the soul still will hold the choice. It's usable, but will I use it? And it may choose to. Now, in this, briefly, before we proceed, we dwell upon something else. The contrast of individualized on the surface. That's me, my personality here. What does that mean? You've seen people who are kind of amorphous in their individualization. That means very fluid and unformed in the personality. And you can say of them that, oh, such and such, he can be bullied, he can be pushed, and he will adjust to any situation. It's often seen even as a good thing. We had a discussion yesterday in a different context of how for a long time women were not allowed to develop an individuality by society, for the very reason that you had to maintain the stability of the family, and if the male was individualized and the female also became equally individualized, there would all be too much clash and instability. So the female was not allowed to develop individuality. She had to adapt and adjust to the demands of the masculine part of the society. And it served, but practical result was, although the urge of the soul was towards individualization, the personality was kept dulled, hit, depressed. It would push back, but not be allowed a free flow. I shared an example which is worth repeating, how the mother would go to the tennis ground with an attendant, and every time after the game, between pauses, she would ask her attendant, who's that person, as if she couldn't see. And after a while, the attendant noticed that she would ask this question every time when it was a woman. And the attendant asked, "Why is it that you ask this only of women?" And the mother said, when she looks at a person, she sees not just the physical form, but the whole subtle being. And in the women, it was not so clearly formed because the individualization had not taken place of the personality. And that's why she said, "I can't recognize very clearly who it is." But she never had that question about men. But then mother said to the attendant, she said, "But now that I'm here, all this will change." And one of the first things she did in the ashram school, in the educational system, was to give equal place and freedom for women in all activities, including physical training programs. Women had to wear shorts, shirt, like the boys. For a while, initially, because of the social standards, they wore only long sleeves, which of course prevent you from running, prevent you from doing cartwheels and gymnastics. And the mother picked the one girl who was most individualized and perhaps ready and bold. She told her, "Tomorrow you will wear shirts and shorts." Now imagine a single girl wearing shirt and short walking into the playground when all the other boys and girls are there differently. It was for her a matter of great courage, and mother showed this to everybody and said, "Hereafter all of you will wear this dress." She herself designed something called a kitty cap. If you've ever seen our students here, they bind it to bind the hair around. And then at that point, the boys and girls are wearing exactly the same clothes, doing exactly the same activities. And there were a lot of pushbacks from girls. Some of them said, "Oh, my femininity is affected if I build muscles. I can't build muscles. I want to be feminine." And mother was very harsh in response. She said, "For God's sake, can't you stop thinking whether you're a boy or a girl and try to be a human being?" And this was given in a very powerful message. The result was she broke those formations. Not just for the people here, because it was linked to humanity, it had the effect of shattering those stereotypes and awakening in humanity the need for this shift, which you see then happening in the 60s. And becoming more stable in the 70s, but after that in the 80s and 90s, it has almost become the norm, except for a few pockets in the world which still are resistant. But mass of humanity has already shifted to that equal recognition. And we are not speaking of rights, but of the development of consciousness and the individualization of consciousness. And today you can see men who are not so well formed as much as women, but equally well formed, both men and women, with their formed individuality. And it's seen not just in the physical development, but in the poise of the consciousness. And of course it can represent in the aura as a clear formed aura, but you sense immediately that this is a formed individuality. Now this is the first step. Where is this formation taking place? In the surface part. And then the formation must bridge with the inner layers and align to the inner mind and the inner Purusha, whose values now should lead this outer individuality formation. Not primarily ego-driven, but by driven and integrated with the deeper inner values. We are not yet speaking about the soul, remember. Not yet the psychic being. It does not require yet a spiritual development or a psychic development. Formed individuality on the surface, which is effective as a center, stable center, integrated with the inner, led by the inner consciousness, in this case the inner mind, because he's speaking of the mental body, and then made plastic enough. Now the plasticity being almost the opposite of the formation, it must be there from the very beginning. Now what does it mean? We had a conference once organized by Dr. Kirit Joshi, where the theme he had set was universal personality or universal individuality, something like that. And all of us who came from the ashram or Aurobindo, were of course familiar with this idea. And then there were the usual philosophers who were trained in the conventional philosophy education, and all of them had a resistance to this idea. One of them, who was a very famous philosopher, said This is a contradiction in terms. To be universal, you cannot be personality. If you're personality or individualized, you cannot be universal. And he pushed this forward very hard. Nobody spoke up. And after a while, I felt I had to nudge in because I couldn't allow it to sit silent. So I said, and I put it very mildly, I said, with all respect, isn't it possible that an individuality is formed and then the individual now begins to appreciate the variety and the scope of larger possibilities and adapts itself, becomes more flexible to a wider and wider range of possibilities while still maintaining its individuality. And as I was describing this, the fellow got rattled because possibly it didn't fit into his line of thinking. And he said, that's the problem with you people. You do not have the rigor of the philosophy teaching. Well, whatever it was. But he couldn't counter that point. This is the point here. An individuality at first may be small, may appear to be narrow, but if it stays in its smallness and narrowness, it's useless. It must be shed. But if it grows, if it widens, you can increase the fan if you need. If it grows, if it widens and it becomes more plastic, then it can hold its center while still extending, while still growing and maintain its plasticity. Now I'm reminded of an example. All of us have a strong individuality in our preference for food, isn't it? You like some things, you don't like some things. When you're given food that you don't like, you'll see most of the older people will say, no, this doesn't suit my stomach, or simply, I don't like it. I would like to have this, and they're very fixed. You will see, the more you have grown aged, you go to a familiar eating place. What do you order? And if the waiter knows you well, you'll say, the usual. You don't even bother to repeat, because it's the same thing that you're eating. You've sub-narrowed yourself. And in contrast, if a child is brought up at every step, told, you must learn to enjoy every food that is placed before you. It's not easy at first, but you can cultivate it. And you have developed an individuality which was flexible from the beginning. Interesting. Individuality does not mean rigidity. You can have individuality which is flexible. Individuality is the centering and organizing around a center, but the organization from the beginning can be made plastic. Not only plastic, but also remember it must meet the needs of the infinite, so it must grow wider. So, first you have a plasticity, and second you have a wideness. Not only I can adjust to all kinds of food, but also I can break beyond my boundaries of what I think is food and push further. The mother was particular about this in certain cases, and mother's attendant tried to replicate that with some of us. And when somebody said, as a principle, I will not eat non-vegetarian food, and not always, but sometimes, the mother said, oh, in that case, we have to break your principle. And she forced the fellow to eat non-vegetarian food or take alcohol or whatever it was. And mother's attendant, Kumudman, was a bit like that. She caught that principle, and I don't remember where we were sitting somewhere, and they had a little bit of alcohol. I still don't remember from what it was. It was for medicinal use or something. We were sitting for somebody, healing somebody, and then she asked me, have you ever tasted it? I said, no, I don't. As a principle, I don't. I made the mistake of using the word as a principle. But I said, I have nothing against it. But for my principle, I chose. And the moment I said that word, she caught, it became a bug for her. No, in that case, I am going to force you. I am going to force you. And she literally placed this thing before me. So I took it as an action of the mother. I said, all right. So I took a single drop. And then she said, no, but you have to take the rest. And so I slowly slid it and poured it into the flower pot which was nearby. She didn't see that, and she was happy that I seemed to have taken more. But I accepted the point. I broke the principle by taking the drop, and that was it. But then it taught me this point, that why? Why do we put the boundaries? And often the boundary itself is a limiting factor. It doesn't mean now you have to start eating everything and trying out all the junk that's out there. But in your consciousness, can you widen yourself not only to feel it acceptable, to accept that there are other traditions which need to eat differently or have different standards of whatever their life forms are, corresponding to their evolution or corresponding to their environment. The Eskimo needs to eat the fat from the animal because he doesn't have vegetables. But also expand your mind further in everything. And so that's part of the training which the mother tried to bring into the ashram school, by ensuring the children were not locked into one frame of culture. So she had the best of the West, the best of the East, and all traditions somehow as if attempted to be represented to whatever degree was practical. In Aurobindo, you will see the same idea. Not only it's a universal township, meaning you have people from all cultures and all nations, but the best of each culture she wanted represented in pavilions which would hold that. So that each pavilion not only it's not just the food you give, you have to live the value. And people can enter those spaces and experience what it's like to live those values and thus widen themselves. And by going through all those spaces, develop a kind of a universality of consciousness in a single lifetime. You can't go to all those countries, but you can traverse those pavilions and accept to plastify your personality and develop this. Of course, all of these things can be done by spiritual process. Both the formation of individuality can happen by the emergence of the psychic being. The bridging of the outer and the inner can happen by the psychic being now coming forward and forming the bridge under its influence. And third, the plastifying of the consciousness can happen by the spiritual influence settling into the substance of your mind and bringing into it a touch of the infinite and awakening into it a softness and plasticity and wideness of consciousness. So you will see in Mother speaking to people, and even in many of Sri Aurobindo's letters, this aspect. Not only you should become plastic to the touch of the divine, but you should become wide in the plasticity. And the result is now that you are open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. And yet in the initial formation, none of these, either psychic or spiritual development, were implied. But you can see that this can be achieved most directly by the influence of the psychic or the spiritual coming forward. Then now, having discussed this in great detail around the mind, he says, a similar individualization, integration and openness of the vital being on the surface would alone make possible a similar survival of the life part in us, the outer vital personality representative of the inner life being the vital Purusha. The same thing on the vital level. So we don't need to go into detail. But briefly what that would mean is your life energies, life instincts, and associated with it all the likes and dislikes and the sense of comfort. You see, the mind brings values. You go into a culture where they do things differently and you have a prejudice. That's your mind's limitation. But the vital limitation is when you enter a very different vibration of energy or a type of energy, you feel a shrinking. It's not a mental judgment, it's an inability to accept energetically a different way of being or doing. But effectively the same principles now operating in the level of the life force, and with it the entire bundle of life instincts, which seep eventually all the way into the physical consciousness. What would really happen, having described all this, and remember also here he says, similar openness of the vital being on the surface, which is what you're trying to carry over into the next life. It should become individualized, interiorized and bridged with the inner vital and the inner vital Purusha, and yet open and plastic to the touch of the progressive touch of the infinite. What would effectively happen when you accomplish this, even without a spiritual basis for it? What would really happen then is that the wall between the inner self and the outer man would have been broken down. And the permanent mental and vital being from within, the mental and vital representatives of the immortal psychic entity, would govern the life. So now you can see how this same result is accomplished by the spiritual development or the psychic development. But the first step is the breaking of these barriers. Now this is most simply or most obviously seen by the opening of the chakras, the entry points, the link points between the inner and outer personality. When those open more and more progressively, then the inner and outer consciousness begin to be joined more and more. How do you do this? Well, you could do it by various specialized processes, or in the integral yoga, by a process of interiorization and bridging of the inner and outer, or by the opening and widening of the consciousness top down, and so on. Practical result will be the bridging of the inner and outer, so that not yet the soul, but its representative in your personality, that is the inner mental Purusha, inner vital Purusha, now begin to come forward. And it is around their influence that the personality is organized. But they are representatives of the immortal psychic entity. And so when those parts of you begin to govern your life, you have come a step closer to the direct influence of the psychic being. And therefore, in such a case, the psychic being could absorb that part of the personality and its development and carry it into the next, infuse it into the next body, and literally you would have to some degree carried over the sense of I was the person who has made the transition, and perhaps even recalling some sense of the memory of the transition and even the in-between passage. I left the body, I drifted, I was in this state, I experienced those things in the inner worlds, and then at some point I became conscious and I chose this space because it felt the best for my growth. And I chose these parents, or I felt familiarity and closeness with them. And then I remember the sense of taking birth. To that extent, not in detail, but the broad sense of continuity of personality. A lot of detail would still be lost because of the entry into the physical body itself being a shock, and the brain being so less formed or unformed to hold the full content of your mind. And in such a case, something would be infused, and as the brain and personality grow, more of what is held behind would come forward to be infused. Until, if so made in a complete transition, as you grow up, more and more of those memories or the sense of continuity would come up. They may carry contents or elements of memory which the psychic being feels worthwhile, but doesn't mean all the details. You may or may not remember names and other things, but the sense of what I did in the life, where I was broadly. It's interesting how it comes. If you don't remember specifics of names, you don't remember the country in which you were, the name of the city, the language you spoke, or your name, but you'll still say, it feels like it was somewhere in this place, in this climate. The feel of consciousness associated with that space still carries over, and the imprint of the cultural elements valued for the soul would carry over, and the familiarity with it. I remember one of the sadhikas in the ashram, when she went to Europe and she sang in a church, suddenly the vivid memory came back of singing like this in one of her previous incarnations. That was one of the flashes which the soul had kept as one of its values. Recall also in the previous two paragraphs ago, Sri Aurobindo discussed how memories from the past life can still be accessed, or what can remain. And things like this would be carried over very likely, but not necessarily. It is rather the sense of continuity of, I am the same person that was, and I carry broadly the sense of similar mind formation, but now it feels more fresh in this new body. more young, more light, more bright, because the vehicle is different, but still the sense of continuity of personality. With it, the same sense of values and ideals, and with it, the same commitment to the spiritual progress and development. And if this can be done, if this can be made, then you have made your base for an effective immortality of continuity across forms. You do not need that chip which is plugged inside your body, as in that TV series that I spoke of, Altered Carbon. You are the person that is carried and carrying across bodies. Our mind nature and our life nature could then be a continuous, progressive expression of the soul, and not a nexus of successive formations preserved only in their essence. What is now is one formation, essence preserved, another formation, essence preserved. Instead, you will have mind-life frame carried by the soul, transitioning in a continuity across bodies. But it will be still the soul that carries and develops and unfolds and grows. It means also you will have the sense of being a soul much more than the surface personality. Even if not obviously, not consciously. In the new personality, the sense of the soul might be behind, but it will be there because it will have brought the personality elements. And the sense of the memory would be there. It may still involve a deepening of the contact, a bridging of the gap between the outer and inner, which may not be so rigid. It may still involve the full identification with the psychic personality, but all of these would be easy and accessible because that has always been the carrier of the personality, and its influence on the personality would be strong. And so, our mental personality and life personality would then subsist without dissolution from birth to birth. They would be in their sense, but they would be in this sense immortal, persistently surviving, continuous in their sense of identity. This would be evidently an immense victory of soul and mind and life over the inconscient and the limitations of material nature. That's the rest of the paragraph. What will be the limitation of this persistence? Because it's stopping short of the physical body. What are the nuances of this limitation? What is the life personality and the victory of the soul and mind and life over the material nature, etc.? We will study in more detail next Friday. But we have here the first base upon which a conscious practice can be cultivated to develop this sense of continuity across lives, that we do not have to start afresh into the next. We will see next time what the mother has to say about the need for this kind of a continuity for the purpose of this yoga, and in particular the physical transformation which is aimed at in this yoga. So for now we reread the sentence which describes the three requirements, and then we can meditate on it. It could happen if our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface and so much one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress.